Volcanic apocalypse. How ancient eruptions plunged Earth into darkness. In the early 19th century, when Western science was still in its infancy, people knew almost nothing about volcanoes. In fact, they had never even seen one. Their only knowledge of these fiery giants came from ancient texts that described how the gods themselves were spitting fire into the sky. They had no idea that they were actually reading scientific accounts of real volcanic eruptions. It would take a massive eruption to change all of that. On April of 1815, Mount Tambora roared back to life with an explosive force that can only be described as biblical. The Indonesian island was struck by a series of earthquakes followed by the largest volcanic eruption of the modern era. The blast was heard 2,000 kilometers away and shook buildings in Australia. So great was the force of the explosion that it was visible even during the day. And those who witnessed the event believed that the end of the world was at hand. It's now thought to have been 7 times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki during World War II. The surrounding area was completely obliterated, with thousands of people burnt or suffocated by toxic fumes. Entire villages were buried under a blanket of hot ash, and the island itself was literally split in two. This was a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. But there was worse to come. As the smoke cleared and the fires burned themselves out, the full extent of the damage became clear. 43,000 people lay dead in the surrounding areas, victims of the blast and the famine that would inevitably follow. The eruption also caused temperatures around the world to plummet. The following winter was so harsh that it killed hundreds of thousands of people in Europe and North America. Crops froze in the ground, livestock perished, and food shortages led to widespread starvation. But perhaps the most terrifying thing of all was the darkness. Eyewitnesses said that for days after the initial eruption, they could not see the sun. Huge clouds of volcanic ash had blotted out the light and plunged the world into perpetual blackness. People panicked, believing that the end of the world was truly at hand. It was even said that clergy members took advantage of the chaos and offered prayers of salvation for a hefty price. In fact, the darkness lasted for years. Between 1816 and 1817, people in North America and Europe experienced what became known as the year without a summer. So great was the darkness that people stopped planting crops, and many farmers simply abandoned their fields. Bread got so expensive that bakers were forced to weigh the flour rather than counting out cups. People turned their homes into makeshift bakeries, desperately trying to keep alive by baking small quantities of bread over open fires. And yet, for all its horror, this was only the beginning. For Tambora was not the first time that volcanic eruptions had plunged the world into darkness. There were other instances throughout history when nature unleashed hell on Earth. And each time, it brought humanity to the brink of annihilation. Before we begin, we want to thank you for taking the time to tune in. If you find our videos interesting and educational, please take a moment to subscribe. It really helps us grow. Now, let's get into the video. It was a scene straight out of the apocalypse. Ash rained down from the sky like poisonous snow. The air grew thick with suffocating smoke, blotting out the sun and plunging entire cities into darkness. Thousands of people ran for the hills, desperate to escape the wrath of the gods. But there was nowhere to go. The deadly cloud engulfed everything in sight, killing thousands every second. Mount Vesuvius had erupted, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Today, we know that Vesuvius was not some malevolent deity, but a natural phenomenon called a volcano. These mountains are formed by molten rock deep inside the earth, which finds its way to the surface through vents and cracks. When the pressure becomes too great, the molten rock, known as magma, bursts out in a spectacular display of fire and fury. But while volcanoes are incredible natural wonders, they can also be incredibly dangerous. That was something the Romans didn't fully realize until it was too late. On August of 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius unleashed a torrent of fire and brimstone on the nearby city of Pompeii. The residents had no warning and were caught completely by surprise. The eruption was so violent that it literally blew the city to smithereens. Buildings collapsed, streets cracked, and everything in sight was consumed by molten lava. Incredibly, though, the city wasn't destroyed instantly. Instead, Vesuvius released deadly gases and ash that slowly blanketed the city, killing everyone in its path. The entire population of Pompeii perished that day. In fact, the disaster affected much more than just Pompeii. Nearby Herculaneum was also devastated, along with several smaller towns and villages. All told, it's estimated that between 16,000 and 25,000 people died. But perhaps even more shocking was the amount of land that was destroyed. The blast obliterated 130 square kilometers of territory, leaving behind a wasteland of hardened lava and toxic ash. To make matters worse, the local government did little to help survivors. The people of Pompeii were largely left to fend for themselves, scavenging whatever they could from the wreckage. But it wasn't all that bad. After the dust had settled, the ruins of Pompeii were incorporated into the Roman Empire. In fact, the city was rebuilt and continued to thrive. It would be another 1,500 years before the true horror of the disaster was uncovered. In 1748, a man named Domenico Fontani stumbled across a brick engraved with the words Pompeii. He had no idea that he was looking at one of the most important archaeological sites in human history. It would take another 22 years before the true scale of the disaster was realized. In 1772, the Italian architect and archaeologist Rocco Algarotti discovered a series of frescoes buried beneath the ashes of Pompeii. News of the discovery spread like wildfire, and soon a team of researchers arrived on the scene. By the early 19th century, the entire site had been excavated, and the story of Pompeii was finally being told. In the centuries since, scientists have learned a lot about volcanoes and how they work. They now know that Vesuvius is actually one of the most active volcanoes in the world. It's been brewing for nearly 2 million years, and has had more than 100 major eruptions. For obvious reasons, scientists monitor Vesuvius very closely. Researchers believe that the next eruption will likely be much more severe than any that came before. It's only a matter of time until the mountain erupts again. And when it does, the consequences will be catastrophic. This time, however, people will be prepared. On September 24, 1257, the people of Hyenkyo awoke to a strange orange glow. At first, they assumed it was a particularly beautiful sunrise. But as the hours passed, the glow became more intense. By nightfall, the sky was filled with a fiery red light, and people began to panic. What they were witnessing was the birth of a new mountain. Mount Unzen had awakened after lying dormant for more than 600 years, and it wasted no time making its presence felt. The eruption was so violent that it literally split the country in two. Pyroclastic flows swept across the land, obliterating everything in their path. Towns were wiped off the map, villages were turned to ash, and millions of people lost their lives. Survivors fled to higher ground, but even that wasn't safe. Volcanic mud, also known as debris flows, cascaded down the slopes of the mountain, engulfing entire valleys. Entire families were buried alive in the sludge, and the cries of children echoed across the land. To make matters worse, the eruption caused a massive earthquake. Buildings collapsed, grain stores fell, and fires raged through the countryside. The people of Japan had never seen anything like it. The fires eventually spread to Kyoto, the nation's capital, where they continued to burn for 3 long months. When the fires finally died down, the damage was catastrophic. Nearly half of Kyoto was in ruins, and hundreds of thousands of people were dead. Food and supplies were in short supply, and many people died of starvation. But perhaps even more terrifying was the darkness. Ash and smoke filled the sky, and the sun was blotted out. Many people believed that the end of the world had come and spent their final days praying for salvation. The Japanese would later refer to the event as the fire of the end of the world. After the skies cleared, the people of Japan emerged from their homes to find a changed world. Crops had withered in the fields and farm animals had perished. The fires had destroyed much of the country's food supply, and many people died of starvation. In the years that followed, Mount Unzen continued to erupt. For more than a century, the Japanese people endured endless earthquakes, volcanic mud flows, and choking ash. Even today, they continue to live under the shadow of the mountain. Mount Unzen may be one of Japan's most beautiful natural landmarks, but it's also one of its most dangerous. If it erupts again, the consequences will be devastating. But thankfully, scientists are keeping a close eye on the mountain, and they're confident that they'll be able to predict any future activity. Click here to watch another one of our videos you might enjoy, or click here to subscribe. Thanks for watching.